Hello and welcome to the FatBoss Guide to Argus on Mythic in Antorus, the Burning Throne.
So as this is the final boss of the instance, you're probably thinking that it's going to be difficult, and you're right. However, after watching this guide, it should reduce your pull count significantly, because primarily the fight is all about just knowing where to stand at what point, and just knowledge of the mechanics and the spell timings. The DPS requirement isn't very demanding, providing your entire raid stays alive in the last phase, and the healing requirement also isn't a big deal, as primarily it's about using CDs at the right time. And to add, there is no strict class requirement for this boss, and essentially you can bring almost any composition you like. As for what we recommend, however, is that we find that 6 melee is best. Any higher can be sort of problematic when spreading with a new debuff, which we'll get into shortly. For your healing composition, it can be free healed, as it was done in the early weeks by most guilds, but nowadays, after the changes that they made to the chains in the last phase, 4 healers is definitely safer. As for what healers to bring, again, pretty much any composition can work. However, healers with CDs that last over a long period of time, such as Aura Mastery, Healing Tide Totem, Tranquility, those sort of things, they're going to be more useful than, say, a Monk's Revival. As for tanks, you'll want to bring 3. 2 tanks to deal with the boss for the majority of the time, and a 3rd tank to deal with orbs in the last phase. Argus himself doesn't really do too much damage to the tank aside from his scythes. Once above 2 stacks and you're going to need a solid CD or active mitigation, or it's likely you'll be one shot on the 3rd application. In phase 3 you're going to need to take 4 hits before dying on the 5th hit multiple times throughout this final phase. And this is made even more difficult when the scythe timings can change on a pull by pull basis, simply because the boss's spells will occasionally queue. As a result, some tanks are going to be much stronger for this job than others. Monks are definitely best for this job, as just by having active mitigation up, you can survive even beyond 5 scythes. That said, any tank can do the job. Just be prepared to use trinkets such as the Agamar trinket just to help you with those later scythes. External cooldowns can also be used on the tanks, but typically healers will want to save them for other targets. As for your orb soaking tank, we would recommend again monks. However, DKs are also pretty good at the job. The orbs can spawn quite far away from the boss, and ideally you'll want to soak them as soon as possible. Tanks like paladins will struggle to keep the active mitigation up and soak at the same time without the orbs becoming dangerously close to the raid. Again though, any tank can do this job. And with all that composition information out the way, let's jump straight into phase 1.
So the boss in this phase mechanically works just like Heroic. You'll still have the cone to dodge at 100 energy, and you'll also still have the Tortured Rage raid hit, as well as Soul Blight and buff orbs. For the tanks you will have the sweeping scythe all fight long. The timers however have completely changed for these abilities, and the overlaps as a result have become far more deadly, so healing cooldowns through this phase are best used on overlaps where Soul Blights are timing out and you have a Tortured Rage cast at the same time. Also, a huge spanner is thrown into the works as you must deal with a new debuff for the entire fight. On a timer, the boss will apply Sargeras Gaze to non-tank players. You'll have 1 fear and 1 rage debuff. The fear debuff is a clear red circle around a player. If no other players within that circle, then the player will begin to gain a stacking 20-second dot. Just 2 stacks of this dot will force your healers to spot heal you heavily, and with other abilities in play such as the Soul Blight and Tortured Rage, this dot can really kill you very fast. As for the rage debuff, it's a red circle with a spiky square on top of it. This debuff is the complete opposite of the fear. It will apply a dot to any other players who stand within it, and this dot deals similar damage to the fear, and as a result it's just as deadly. These debuffs only drop when they are reapplied to the raid, and this is about every 30 seconds during phase 1. Initially the boss will apply a single rage and a single fear debuff. However, each time the ability is cast, he will apply 1 more of the debuffs to the raid, alternating between adding an additional fear and adding an additional rage each and every time. Fears can be applied to any non-tank player, as can the rage debuff. However, the rages will always try and spread across your raid evenly amongst ranged and melee players. This is shown most obviously at the beginning of the fight because the first rage debuff will always be placed on a melee player. Then when a new rage debuff is placed in, so you have 2 of them, 1 will be on a melee and 1 will be on a ranged. When the 3rd new rage debuff comes in, so you have 3 of them now, 2 of them will go on melee and 1 of them will go on ranged. Then when the 4th comes in, you have 2 on melee and 2 on ranged, and it continues to go like this until the end of the encounter. Now the biggest issue with these debuffs is how they begin to tick. The time it takes for you to begin to receive dot stacks because either no one is stood within your fear circle, or if you're stood on top of someone else's rage circle, this time is less than a second, which really doesn't leave you a lot of time to react. The downtime between your previous debuffs dropping and the new debuffs being applied is 3 seconds. In this time, you need to be spread out enough so that the raid isn't instantly decimated by a bunch of rage circles, but at the same time you can't be so spread that individuals with the fear circles gain excessive stacks. For ranged players this is pretty easy, you just need to be roughly spread 8 yards apart from one another. Rage players remain still and do not move when they receive their debuff. This just prevents players from accidentally receiving any stacks. As for the fear players, they all run together as well as being assisted by the rest of the raid. This isn't always perfect, you'll likely have a couple of people get a stack occasionally here and there, but as long as no one's got a shit ton of them, you'll be absolutely fine. Now as for melee, you do need to use a much stricter positioning system. We create 2 triangle formations underneath the boss, one on his left hand side and one on his right hand side. Each corner of the triangles is around 5 yards apart. This allows melee to still do damage regardless of what debuff they have, but also be able to move to either assist fears or move away from rages. Throughout phase 1, melee rages move through the boss to the right hand side when it's safe to do so when the scythe is on CD and no one is in the way. As melee players with the rage can never be targeted by the cone of death, they do not need to be lined up with the rest of the raid, so they can just sit on the right hand side of the boss. If you have more than 6 melee players, you could do other formations instead. We just find that any more than 6, it does become very crowded in melee, especially in the last phase.
So with all that explained, let's look through phase 1 all the way through. On the pull, the boss is pulled away from the middle of the room and the raid stacks behind. Tanks taunt swap after 3 scythes throughout this phase and move the boss slowly around the room after each cone. Tanks, you'll want to pay very close attention to the boss positioning on screen now throughout the phase. Melee spread for the first Sargeras debuffs, and the rage stays on the far right hand side. Shortly afterwards, the first buff orbs come in. For this first set, we place haste on the left and crit on the right. The raid gets their buff, and the melee rage gets his afterwards. Not long after, you'll have to move for your first cone. As you move here, it's important that you do not move too close to the boss, as the boss can scythe immediately afterwards. You'll then get your first set of soul blights. Note that players with fear debuffs can also get soul blights. We assign our third tank and hunters to escort these players out so they can drop their debuffs behind the raid. At the same time, new buff orbs will come. We place both of these on the left hand side of the raid and both those players return back to the group. It's vital that no one picks up these buffs yet, as the boss is about to cast a cone again. At the same time, melee also need to spread because of the Sargeras debuffs. When the cone is cast, we move into our buffs, whilst any players left with a soul blight drop it as they move slightly behind the group, making sure they're always in the same line as the raid. Your next set of soul blights work the same way, however this time we use a stampeding roar as the cone comes in, so it's much easier to deal with. As we move, new orb buffs are dropped again on the left hand side of the raid. After everyone has got their buff refreshed, you'll then have your first ranged Sargeras rage. Everyone spreads and then stacks after the debuffs have been applied. Now ranged rages, unlike melee ones, can be targeted for a cone. As a result, ranged players that are afflicted by the rage must stand behind the raid so the cone isn't placed in front of the group, but near enough to the raid that they can actually avoid the cone cast itself. During this next cone, you'll have new soul blights and buff orbs. These orbs are placed on the left hand side of the raid. Everyone refreshes their buff and then stacks underneath the boss. It's at this point you'll be very close to transitioning into phase 2. Now before we end phase 1, we should probably talk about this transition because even though it looks very simple, it's actually very important that you do it right. Now ideally you'll want to transition before or after the next cone. If you're going to transition after the cone, then you'll want to taunt the boss during the cone cast. This for whatever reason forces him to delay his next Sargeras debuffs cast, giving you a couple of extra seconds to transition him without getting the next set. If you don't pull this off, however, you will then of course need to spread and then you can transition. This does, however, completely mess up timers during phase 2, making it more difficult and in some situations flat out bullshit. If you, however, transition it so late that after you spread, you also get another set of debuff orbs and soul blights, the timers will then be fine. So phase 2 in itself is actually super simple and the easiest phase by far. It works the same way as Heroic, except the soul bombs hurt far more, the blades across the room will delete any player that gets hit, and on top of that, of course, you still have the fears and rages from phase 1. Now, if you transitioned after the cone and got a new set of Sargeras debuffs, but nothing else, it will cause the boss to place the bomb debuffs before he casts the Sargeras debuffs for the whole of phase 2. Now this is problematic because bomb players are not immune to getting rage debuffs, whereas the boss has been designed so that the rage debuff players are instead immune to receiving bombs. So with these shit timers, you can get a healer with a bomb, stack underneath the tank, and then get a rage, which will then kill both of them. In this situation, always sacrifice the bomb players rather than the tanks. But let's go through the phase from the start with correct timers because you transition properly.
So the moment that the storm has stopped, the third tank taunts the boss, takes a scythe and then moves the boss towards the edge of the room. Once the third tank gets the Agromar buff, one of the other tank then taunts. Shortly afterwards you have your first Sargeras Gaze, followed up by bursts and a bomb. The bomb on Mythic ticks extremely hard. The third tank must escort the bomb and the burst towards the opposite side of the room. Meanwhile, everyone else stacks underneath the boss. Note that the rages are spread equally on the left and right hand side of the boss just to make sure that everyone can remain in range of the boss whilst also being very far away from the bombs exploding on the other side of the room. For the tank to survive all 3 debuffs expiring on top of him at the exact same time, you essentially need a 90% damage reduction. We only do this once throughout the entire fight, so if you need to throw shit on that tank, then feel free to. After the bombs are over, the 3 players return to the raid with the tank. From this point onwards, we explode the bursts in melee and stack on whatever tank has the Agromar buff. This isn't actually needed as the raid won't die from the burst damage alone, it just makes it far more cleaner and much easier for the healers to heal. As for the bombs on the healers, these are all sacrificed from this point onwards. We set up a gateway in the middle of the room and the healers one by one kill themselves when their bomb is applied, making sure that they're far away from the raid when they do eventually die. The healing requirement in this phase is actually very small when you're using this melee burst strategy, and as a result you can afford to have a few dead healers at the back of the room. You can however save yourself by bubbling the debuff off or using an Ankh totem if you wish, just note that both of them won't necessarily be available for the last phase as a result. As for the rest of the phase, just keep an eye on the Sargeras Gaze timers and make sure you dodge blades, it's really that easy. The gaze in this phase comes in every 60 seconds rather than every 30, and as a result you should look to transition the boss into phase 3 before he casts his 6th. The moment you transition the boss at 40%, you'll want to stack with your debuffs and kill yourselves off. This allows your pots to come off cooldown earlier. After a long transition that gets super old, super fast, you'll then be able to release and use the tree and begin phase 3.
Now this phase is completely different to what you've seen on Heroic and has lots of new abilities for you to deal with. To start off with is the modules. A single module will spawn on a timer on a non-tank, non-rage debuff player. These modules increase in size the longer they're up, just like they did on Heroic, however the area does not despawn when the module dies, and standing within the patch that's left behind will kill you off very quickly. This is the pseudo-enrage of the encounter. You need to kill the boss before the entire room is covered and you have nowhere else to stand. And as a result, it's very important that these modules spawn in set locations and are killed very quickly to maximize the space that you have. You're going to need to kill a total of 4 of these throughout the phase, and when the 5th one spawns, you ignore it and nuke the boss. Next to talk about is the chains. On a timer, 2 players will receive a 30-second debuff. This debuff hurts like absolute hell. At different points, you'll either need to hold or remove these chains. You can remove them by moving a little over 40 yards away from where you originally received it. When the chain breaks and the debuff is removed, or if the debuff just times out, the entire raid will receive a nasty 10-second dot, and this dot will stack if multiple chains are broken. These chains come throughout the phase every 60 seconds, and healing cooldowns are used to cover every single set apart from one of them. One thing to note about these chains is that they can be applied to players with any Sargeras debuff. So if you have a fear in a chain, you're going to need to be escorted in order to break the chain. You can also break these chains by using Feign Death, Vanish or Invis just to save you having to run, but that's the only thing that works, don't bother trying immunities. You'll need to break 4 sets of chains throughout the fight and you'll need to out-heal the 5th. Also to deal with is blades. These blades will begin to spin, covering one half of the room. A new set will then appear on the direct opposite side of the room. The first set will then shoot across, firing between the second set of blades. The second blades will then spin and then fire out shortly afterwards. Standing in the middle of the room is a complete death sentence without using an immunity or a blessing of protection, so these blades are counted by standing at the edges of the room and using the simple rule of stand on them if they're still and move away from them if they're spinning. And if the blades spawned on you in the first place, as soon as they've gone away from you, just stand on top of where they previously was. You'll have to deal with these blades a total of 3 times throughout this last phase. Next to mention is the scythes. So in phase 3 they deal more damage, the debuff is now permanent, and they'll spawn orbs. Each time a tank is hit, a single orb will spawn per stack that the tank gains from the hit. So the tank gets 2 stacks from the hit, he'll spawn 2 orbs, 3 stacks, 3 orbs, 4 stacks, 4 orbs, etc. And these orbs will spawn randomly throughout the room and begin to fixate a player. Once they reach the player, they'll explode, dealing lethal damage to pretty much anyone without a damage reduction or a large health pool. As one tank is going to be busy dealing with the boss, it's the job of the other two tanks, primarily the third tank, to go and soak all the orbs as they spawn. You must be extremely careful as you soak them, as they deal such a large amount of damage. If you was to soak say 3 or 4 of them in quick succession, your healers probably aren't going to keep you up. However, there may well be situations where all the orbs have sort of funneled into a single location. That's where you want to start using your large damage reductions. Throughout this phase, apart from at one set point, the tanks will want to simply taunt off each other after the previous tank has died on the 5th scythe. You can use the tree to resurrect after each death. However, you're going to need to save battle reses or Ankh totems towards the end of the encounter, where the tree is long gone. As a tank, whilst running to the tree, you should use that opportunity to also pick up motes of power on the way. Don't go too far out your way, however, to go pick up the motes, as you will need to be up soonish to go and help soak orbs. Last to note is that you'll still have Tortured Rage. This is now on a weird timer that changes throughout the phase, and it deliberately overlaps with chains at set points. So that's all the abilities. Let's talk about how it plays out.
After you've all rezzed from the tree, you want your ranged DPS and healers to move to the opposite side of the room. This is a good point to use your Bloodlust and nuke the boss. To help with this, you want to interrupt the boss as late as possible just to gain as much time as you can in this last phase. Shortly after the interrupt, the boss is moved slightly away from the ranged camp, facing right against the wall. At this point, you'll have your first blades. Using the same rule of stand on them if they're still or move from them when they're spinning, just dodge the blades and then use movement speed increases such as a stampeding roar the moment the second blades have passed. This is where the first gaze comes in. Range spread towards the middle of the room and melee make their triangle formations. Fears move immediately underneath the boss, whilst melee rages move to the left hand side of the boss and ranged rages stay towards the middle of the room. You'll then have your first module spawn. You want to nuke it down and move as a group before it dies. Melee rages should move early so that they do not block the raid positioning. As you move, the first tank should die from his 5th scythe, and the next tank should move the boss to the next position to the side of the module patch, leaving a slight gap between the two areas just to allow tanks to soak orbs. You'll then have your first set of chains. We break both of these simultaneously and use a cooldown to cover it. Note that 2 stacks deals an incredibly large amount of raid damage over 10 seconds, and therefore a really solid cooldown is required. Disc chaining their cooldowns or Paladin Aura Mastery works really well at this point. After a while, you'll then have your next module spawn. The second tank should die to the 5th hit, and the boss should be moved by the first tank as the orb is killed off by the DPS. DPS just kill it the same way as you did, however, as it dies, the range group now must move towards the middle of the room rather than following the boss. This is because you're about to have another set of gazes and you want to be nice and spread out already. After the debuffs have gone out, ranged and melee camps now must go to the wall of the room because blades are coming in shortly. As for anyone who has the rage debuff at this point, if you're ranged, you can stand right in the middle of the room and simply use an immunity if you want. That way you can avoid the blades and you don't get in anyone else's way. And melee, you can stand right on the boss's right hand side and dodge the blades like this guy doing here. However, it can be very, very risky. Ultimately, the best strategy is to completely ignore your damage or any output at this point and just get out of the raid's way and stand towards the tree area. That way they can still dodge the blades and so can you, and you're not going to be giving them a ton of rage stacks. When moving there, wait until the raid is at the wall first. Players with rages are definitely lowest priority when it comes to real estate within the room. Just stand still and wait. It can be painful, but you just got to do it. When the blades are over, you want to restack under the boss, ready for the next module. You'll then have the second set of chains. Now, whilst it's possible to break these chains and outheal the 2-stack dot, it's far safer to break one first and then just let the other debuff time out naturally. This is because of overlaps of the Tortured Rage. We call a single player to break their chain whilst we spam heal the other. It's a good idea to use externals on a chained player whilst the dot is active, just to make sure that they don't die and refresh the dot on the raid. For this first break, we use a healing cooldown here just to help cover the raid damage. When the orb spawns, we swap to it and kill it off, just like we did the others. As the first tank dies to the 5th hit again, instead of the second tank tanking the boss, the third one does instead, and you'll see why in a moment. As the orb dies, the raid once again moves away as a single unit, and the last chain breaks. We use another healing cooldown here just to counter the last chain dot. You'll then have your final set of blades. Again, the rages must move away from the main group of players and dodge the blades. Meanwhile, the second tank will want to taunt the boss after the third tank has received 2 stacks. This tank then wants to stand right next to the old module patch. After the blades have been dodged, you'll then have gazes. For this set, we have the entire raid stack up and die apart from the second tank. This does two things for you. One, you completely skip an entire set of chains as you all die as they're applied to you. Two, the module orb will spawn on the only target left alive, the second tank. The moment the orb spawns, we all release and enter the tree at the same time. By having the third tank taunt 2 stacks before this point, it makes it far more manageable for the second tank to stay alive whilst there's no healing. So saving a cooldown is a really good idea for this point. The moment the raid is alive, you want to have everyone swap to the module and kill it off. Melee need to be careful to watch the scythe here, as the boss will be facing towards the module. We have the tank die on the next scythe, even if it's only stack 4, and the first tank moves the boss away. You'll need to battle res tanks from this point onwards. As soon as that tank is dead, the melee can now swap to the orb because they're definitely not going to get scythed in the face. Meanwhile, we do have one player kill themselves and collect motes downstairs. Shamans with Ghost, Wolf, and Demon Hunters with their passive movement speed increase are fantastic at soaking, but essentially anyone can do it. Using items like movement speed neck from Moral Souls is a good idea. You'll now have downtime to plow some damage into the boss. The boss will cast Tortured Rage back to back 3 times and then you'll get another set of gazes. We use a Stampeding Roar and Spread. Once the debuffs are out, we then immediately stack back up underneath the boss for the last module. During the module, you want to have the first tank die to his 5th stack, and around the same time you'll get chains. For this set, even though most of the cooldowns are up, you want to break one and hold the second. This is again down to timings with the Tortured Rage. We use a large cooldown for each of the chains when they break. Once the orb dies, we move underneath the boss, and this is the last location you have to finish off the boss if you haven't already. As the final chain times out, you have a Tortured Rage. We use a rally and personal cooldowns here. This is like the last really difficult bit to survive. After the dot has expired, you'll then get another set of gazes. It is vital that you spread here as well as you can, which can be difficult as you do have limited space. At the same time, another set of chains will come, as well as the final module. Use externals and personals on the chain targets, and ignore the orb and nuke the boss. After this module dies from either killing itself or passive cleave, it is 100% a wipe, so you've got to kill the boss before this module times out.
And that's pretty much all you need to know for this encounter. Essentially, like we said at the start of the video, providing everyone stays alive in that last phase, the damage requirement isn't that tight and you should be able to kill the boss before that 5th module times out. But to make that even easier, as you can probably tell, you die a lot in this fight, not just from progressing, but as part of the fight, you die with a tree, you die before you even go into the last phase. This means you get to use an extra pot so many times. You really need to try and maximize that just to push the extra damage out. So work out when that would be best used for your class to try and maximize your DPS. But also keep in mind, you'll also get a lot of extra uses of your health stones, and you'll really want to use that when you have overlaps with chain dots as well as rages. But thank you very much for watching, guys. If this guide helped you out, then please do drop us down a like. It helps us out a lot. If you'd like to see a written version of this guide, then do go check out our post over on Wowhead. A link for that can be found in the description. But before we do go, we'd like to give a huge thank you to all of our supporters over on Patreon. You guys are absolutely fantastic. We appreciate all the support you guys give us. And we shall see you all in the next expansion.
Thanks for watching.
Thanks for watching.